You're trespassing on military property. My cousin Tyler shouted across the table fork clattering against porcelain as his voice cut through the clamor of Thanksgiving dinner. His face burned red, not from the wine, but from conviction, like he'd just uncovered a grand conspiracy. The turkey knife paused midair, Aunt June's hand frozen. Everyone turned toward me, their eyes flicking from Tyler to the small rectangle of plastic I'd placed on the table. A Pentagon ID, my name, my clearance, my life compressed into laminated ink. He thought he'd exposed a spy. What he didn't know was that I was his commanding officer. 2 weeks earlier, the letter had arrived in the kind of envelope no one uses anymore. Cream-colored, embossed, the kind meant for weddings or retirements, not for what it carried inside. I knew the handwriting before I even slid it open. Grandma's looping cursive, the same flourished script that used to appear on my birthday cards as a kid, now shaky but still recognizable. Inside Thanksgiving dinner, 6:00 p.m., family only, no excuses. No signature, no warmth. Just the command written like she still ran the family the way she ran Sunday school 30 years ago. I'd stared at it in my Arlington apartment far too long. The city noise hummed through my window's traffic, layering over the faint whistle of a passing train. My desk lamp flickered against the gloss of framed certificates. Commendations, ribbons, campaigns etched into my bones. All proof of a career I could never explain to anyone who didn't live it. I almost tossed the envelope into the trash, but the words stuck. Family only. No excuses. I didn't owe them anything, not after years of silence and distance, not after the whispers about me leaving and never really coming back. Still something gnawed. Maybe obligation, maybe guilt. Maybe the memory of running barefoot through autumn fields with Tyler before either of us knew what war meant, before he decided I'd abandoned everyone. By the following Monday, I'd made up my mind. One night wouldn't kill me. I filed for short leave, not enough to raise questions in the system. My commanding officer signed without hesitation a neat scribble over my request form. I arranged transport the way trained people do, quiet, invisible, efficient. I packed light civilian clothes, pressed flat shoes with no shine, and a face I could wear without betraying who I'd become. In this line of work, blending in wasn't just a skill, it was survival. Chesterville hadn't changed since the day I left. The bus rolled past the same corner gas station where the paint still peeled under the fluorescent lights. The church stood stubbornly on Main Street, cross-crooked from storms no one bothered to fix. Kids loitered outside the diner just like we used to, pretending the world was bigger than the town would ever allow. The air was sharp with wood smoke and wet leaves. My boots crunched against gravel as I stepped down. It felt smaller than I remembered, like the buildings had shrunk or I'd grown too far beyond them. A cabbie eyed me suspiciously when I gave Grandma's address. Maybe it was the tailored coat, maybe the way I carried myself. Not military, not civilian, just something in between. He drove without a word, radio static filling the silence. Grandma's house loomed at the end of Sycamore Lane, same white siding, same tired shutters. But the yard looked trimmed, the porch painted fresh. Tyler's truck was parked out front, its body clean and polished, a shine that screamed of off-duty pride. His police department decal gleamed under the porch light. He'd made it then. The small-town boy who never left now wore a badge. I stood there a moment, feeling the weight of time. Then I rang the bell. The door creaked open. Grandma answered slower than I remembered, shoulders stooped, but her eyes were still sharp as glass. She smiled, small, tired, and pulled me into a hug that smelled of cinnamon and lemon cleaner. "Don't rise to it, sweetheart," she whispered before I even crossed the threshold. I hadn't said a word. The house smelled the same pot roast, cornbread, old wood, polished for company. A new chandelier hung above the dining table, brighter, colder. For half a second I almost called him by another name from the past. But no, this wasn't anyone else. This was Tyler. He had likely chosen it trying to drag modern order into Grandma's old bones of a house. Around the table sat the family aunts and uncles with their polite nods, cousins with their forced smiles, Mom looking worn but still strong in her quiet way. Tyler stood near her, arms folded, badge visible at his belt like a prize. "Look who decided to show up," he said. No effort to hide the sarcasm. "Good to see you too, Deputy," I answered, voice light, steady. A few heads turned. He didn't like that. The table was set for 12. Grandma, once the queen of her table, now sat at the far end, tucked away like a guest. Tyler took the head seat, shoulders squared, jaw set. A new order had been established, one I hadn't been invited to until tonight. I slid into a chair, nodded at faces I hadn't seen in years. Conversation buzzed, small, polite, the kind of chatter that dances around the real issues. I played along, asked about jobs past, dishes, complimented food. I could survive this. But the weight never left. Tyler's gaze kept cutting toward me like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve, or a stain he couldn't scrub out. He saw the coat, the posture, the distance, and he hated it. I ignored him, ate slowly, kept my breathing even, my smile calm. Then halfway through dinner it happened. He slammed his fork against the plate, the clang jolting the room into silence. "You're trespassing on military property," he shouted, pointing straight at me, voice cracking with anger and triumph. Every eye turned. Forks froze midair. Grandma's lips parted, but no sound came. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. The Pentagon ID lay right there on the table, catching the chandelier light. My name. My clearance. Proof I'd placed in plain sight because I'd learned long ago sometimes the loudest truth is silence. Tyler thought he'd cornered me, thought he'd exposed a fraud. What he didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that I outranked him in ways he couldn't imagine. The silence after Tyler's outburst stretched longer than it should have. The turkey cooled on the platter, steam rising into the chandelier light like smoke from a battlefield. Tyler, Aunt June whispered, her hand halfway raised as though she could catch his words and shove them back into his mouth. But Tyler's eyes stayed locked on me, pupils sharp, jaw tight. He wanted me to break first. I leaned back in my chair, lifted my water glass, and sipped. Calm, deliberate, a soldier's silence. "Don't play dumb," Tyler said louder now. "You show up here, waltz in like nothing's changed, flashing that fake badge. What are you hiding, Elena?" Gasps circled the table like a slow wave. Mom shifted in her chair, her fork clinking against her plate. Grandma didn't look up. She just shook her head once, almost imperceptible. My voice came quiet, steady. "That's not a fake badge." He barked a laugh, brittle and forced. "Yeah, prove it. Where's your uniform? Where's your unit? You think you can just disappear for a decade and then strut back in here with a story? Nobody can check." The words sliced sharper than he realized. He wasn't wrong about the disappearing act. I had built an entire career out of being untraceable missions, folded under layers of sealed files and burned reports. For him, that absence was proof. For me, it was survival. I set the glass down, fingers steady even though my pulse had quickened. "You don't want this argument, Tyler." He smirked, leaning forward. "I think I do." Aunt June tried again, nervous laughter trailing her words. "It's Thanksgiving. Maybe we should just eat before everything gets cold." "Sit down, June." Tyler snapped, not even looking her way. His badge caught the light as he shifted, tapping his belt like he wanted everyone to see it. His stage, his rules. I could have shut it down right there. One phone call, one code phrase spoken into a secure line, and federal authority would have rolled over him like a tank across gravel. But that wasn't the training. The training was patience, silence, control. Let the opponent reveal their weakness first. So I passed the rolls. Butter spread. Calm smile. Pretend nothing was wrong. Inside, the old memories itched. running with Tyler through these very fields, climbing the water tower at 16, shouting into the night about how we'd both get out someday. Except I did, and he stayed. Now he wore a badge in the same county where our fathers grew up while I carried scars from deserts and jungles he couldn't even spell. He hated me for leaving, for outranking him in the one way he couldn't measure. Tell them, he pressed. Tell everyone where you've really been. Or are you scared? I let the silence hang. It was a tactic I'd learned in Kandahar when young lieutenants tried to prove themselves with bravado. You don't fight noise with noise. You let it collapse under its own weight. Grandma finally lifted her head. Tyler, she said, soft but sharp. That's enough. But he didn't stop. She's a fraud, Grandma. Don't you see it? Nobody knows where she works. Nobody's seen her in uniform. She shows up with money, with cars, with stories she won't explain. You think that's normal? She's been lying to us. The room thickened with whispers. A cousin I barely recognized shifted uncomfortably. Mom pressed her lips together, eyes darting between us like she was afraid to pick the wrong side. I smiled faintly, not at Tyler, but at the irony. After years of living in the shadows, it wasn't an enemy combatant or foreign agent trying to smoke me out. It was my own cousin at Thanksgiving dinner. Then I noticed movement outside. Through the window across the dining room, a figure loitered just beyond the fence, pretending to walk a dog, except the dog wasn't sniffing, wasn't pulling, wasn't even curious about the ground. It was a man with no leash tension and too much focus on the house. Civilian eyes might have missed it. I didn't. The voice of my old drill instructor echoed in my head. The more civilian it looks, the more military it smells. I chewed slowly, eyes never leaving Tyler. He thought he was orchestrating this drama. He had no idea another stage was already set. Say it, Tyler demanded, voice rising. Say you forged that ID. Say you're not who you claim to be. Admit it in front of all of us. The chandelier buzzed faintly overhead. Someone's fork tapped nervously. My wrists itched with the memory of steel cuffs that dug deep once upon a time. Not tonight. Careful, I murmured. What's that supposed to mean? It means you're stepping somewhere you don't understand. Laughter rippled from the far end, a cousin trying to lighten the mood. But no one laughed with him. The air was too tight, too brittle. Tyler leaned back, but his eyes never left mine. Then enlighten us, Colonel, he sneered. Or should I say, liar. I didn't answer. Not because I couldn't, but because I knew exactly how this game played out. In silence, in patience, in letting the enemy overplay their hand. Mom's voice finally broke through, small, trembling. Please, both of you, this isn't... But Tyler cut her off louder, like he needed the volume to fill the cracks in his certainty. She's not family. She's a fraud. And I'm not letting her sit here and pretend anymore. The fork dropped from my hand, clattering against porcelain loud enough to freeze the room again. I leaned forward just slightly, voice low level. Tyler, I said, you think you're exposing me, but you have no idea who you're pointing at. His face flushed crimson. He grinned like he'd won. And the man outside the fence shifted again, closer now, hand pressed to his earpiece. Thanksgiving dinner had just become something else entirely. The first words out of his mouth weren't even aimed at me. Look, Tyler barked, shoving back his chair with a screech that tore through the silence. He fumbled under the table, pulling out a thick folder wrapped in a rubber band, papers spilling as he slapped it down between the gravy boat and the cranberry sauce. Half the dishes rattled. My mother flinched. Grandma closed her eyes. This, he said, ripping the band free, is everything I need. The folder gaped open. Pages spilled out like guts printouts, blurry photocopies, clippings marked with fluorescent highlighters. Screenshots of message boards, names circled in red pen, strings of arrows connecting things that didn't belong together. He stabbed one page with his finger, breath hot, triumphant. She's not who she says she is. You think she's at the Pentagon, wrong. I've got proof right here. Aliases, forged addresses, bank transfers routed through Delaware. Spy money. Government front. She's been lying for years and nobody wanted to admit it. The air shifted heavy, suffocating. I recognized half the papers before my eyes even finished scanning. Redacted training orders pulled off a cracked database, pieces of legitimate clearance forms spliced with nonsense. Fragments of truth twisted until they looked like lies. Aunt June gasped, hand over her mouth. Oh my lord. Mom's face crumpled like she wanted to speak, but couldn't find words. I stayed still, knuckles tight against the underside of the table. Rage wasn't the training. Rage was noise. Noise could be weaponized. Tyler fanned out the pages like a magician revealing his trick. She's been moving between addresses every year, never the same phone number, no public records for half the time she was gone. And this, he held up a sheet with a grainy photocopy of my Academy ID, half the lamination peeled. Fake. Anyone with a printer could have made this. I almost laughed. That photo had been taken 20 years ago, my hair tucked back in regulation, my jaw tight from the stress of those first weeks. It wasn't fake, it was just raw. Tell me I'm wrong, Tyler demanded, his voice climbing. Tell me you didn't steal someone else's name, someone else's life. Because I swear. I cut him off with silence. A long, deliberate silence that seemed to echo against the walls. His smirk faltered. He wanted the fight. He wanted me flailing, shouting, trying to defend myself with explanations no one at that table could verify. Instead, I gave him nothing. The fork in Grandma's hand shook, clinking against porcelain. Tyler, enough, she whispered, but he bulldozed past her voice. You think she's a hero? She's a ghost. A fraud. Maybe even a traitor. Who disappears for a decade and comes back with government clearance nobody can check. He flung another page across the table. It landed near my plate, sliding to a stop. A wire transfer. My name redacted, black lines covering half the data. He didn't know it, but that was a disbursement from a mission that had cost lives. Classified, sealed. To him, it was evidence of laundering. I lifted it, glanced once, and set it back down without a word. That silence hurt him more than anything else could have. He leaned closer, breath sharp. Why don't you answer? Guilty people stay quiet. Finally I spoke. Calm, unshaken. No. Trained people stay quiet. The words cut sharper than his folder full of conspiracies. A cousin choked on a nervous laugh, then quickly hid it behind his glass. Tyler's face turned crimson. He slammed the folder shut and pointed at me with a trembling finger. You can't sit here and pretend anymore. I'm not letting you. This family deserves to know the truth. His voice cracked, and beneath the anger I saw it desperation. He wasn't just accusing me. He was begging them to believe him, to pick him over me. He needed it the way a drowning man needs air. But I didn't throw him a rope. Instead, I leaned back, let my eyes flick once toward the window where the figure outside still lingered, radio clipped under his jacket. Too far for anyone else to notice, close enough for me to mark his stance as tactical professional. Not Tyler's man, not his PI. Someone else. The timing made sense. Tyler wasn't smart enough to know what doors he'd kicked open. He thought he was playing detective, but the files in his folder were enough to trigger alarms in places he didn't even know existed. And here he was, waving them in the open, daring me to deny them, not realizing the real eyes weren't sitting at this table, they were watching from the yard. Sit down, Grandma said again, firmer this time. But Tyler shook his head, face shining with sweat. Not until she admits it. Not until she tells us who she really is. The chandelier hummed overhead, a faint buzz that felt louder than the voices. My pulse thudded steady in my ears. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I didn't move, didn't answer. Instead, I folded my hands on the table, calm as prayer, and stared him down. He thought my silence was surrender. He didn't realize it was strategy. Because silence makes men like Tyler talk themselves into ruin. The folder didn't appear out of nowhere. Tyler was too sloppy, too impulsive to pull this together himself. No, The stench of outside help clung to every page, every clumsy highlight. And I knew exactly where it began. It was a Tuesday in Arlington, sky bruised with November gray. I'd been at my apartment, a two-bedroom near the metro, small but clean walls lined with bookshelves and locked cabinets that carried more weight than they revealed. I'd returned late from the Pentagon, dropped my bag by the door, and felt it immediately. The air shifted. A soldier knows when someone else has stepped into their perimeter. The rug fibers by the lock were flattened, the faint smell of cigarette smoke wrong for my building, and the subtle scrape across the desk where a drawer had been forced shut. They'd been here, and they hadn't been good at it. I swept the apartment methodically, fingers brushing baseboards, eyes checking light slants for dust lines out of place. My safe, tucked behind a false wall panel, bore faint scratches near the lock. They hadn't cracked it yet, but they'd tried. That was enough. I didn't call it in. Not then. Instead, I reset everything the way it had been filed, a quiet note through a back channel, and waited. The intruder was a man named Howard Denton, licensed PI, part-time bounty hunter, and full-time opportunist. Tyler had hired him with money he didn't really have, selling the lie that he was helping a federal inquiry. Denton never questioned it. Men like him never did when the paycheck was heavy enough. He dug through my life the way amateurs do credit pulls, surveillance outside the Pentagon, following me at a distance he thought was safe. What he didn't realize was that my eyes were trained to feel when I was being followed. He stuck out like a sore thumb in his beat-up sedan, chewing on a toothpick like a badge of honor. He wanted dirt. What he got instead was smoke. Denton managed to snatch copies of a few redacted transfers, a shredded training record, and one old photo from my academy days that leaked through a civilian database. None of it added up. But to Tyler, it was a gold mine. Tyler didn't see fragments, he saw proof. And he decided Thanksgiving dinner was the perfect stage. I stared at the folder, now smudged with gravy, Tyler's fingerprints stamped across every sheet. "You hired someone," I said quietly, the first real words I'd offered him all night. The whole table froze again. His grin widened, victory flashing across his face. "Damn right I did. A professional. Not like your Pentagon cronies. Someone who actually looks for the truth." I tilted my head, studying him like he was an insect under glass. Howard Denton. The grin faltered. His eyes darted just once before he masked it. "Doesn't matter what his name is. What matters is what he found." I leaned forward. "You let a civilian break into my apartment. You let him handle classified files he doesn't understand. You think you're clever, Tyler, but all you've done is light a signal flare in the middle of a war zone." He slammed his hand against the table. "Don't talk to me like I'm an idiot." I didn't answer. Silence was sharper than anything I could have said. Grandma's spoon clattered against her bowl. You broke into her home." "Don't look at me like that," Tyler shot back. "I had to. She's hiding something. You all know it. She comes and goes, never explains, never visits, never tells us where she is. And now I've got proof." He jabbed at the folder again, papers sliding to the floor. A picture of me at 22 fluttered down, catching the edge of a candle flame before I pulled it away. My jawline stiff, my eyes fierce, a younger me who had no idea what wars awaited. "That photo's real," I said softly, "but you don't want to believe it." Tyler laughed harshly. "Yeah, then show us the rest. Show us your medals, your assignments, your so-called missions. Or is everything classified? Convenient, isn't it?" The word dripped from his mouth like poison. Classified. To him it meant a cover-up. To me, it meant lives shielded by secrecy, friends buried without names, victories never spoken aloud. I took a slow breath. "You don't get it. You're playing detective with matches in a powder magazine." He sneered. "Scared I'll blow it up?" "No," I said. My eyes flicked once to the window where the man outside shifted again, now joined by a second silhouette. "I'm afraid you already have." It hit me then, this wasn't about me. It wasn't about exposing a spy or protecting the family. This was Tyler's hunger for validation, for power, for a stage he could finally own. And in chasing that hunger, he'd stumbled into classified corridors that didn't tolerate curiosity. The folder wasn't proof. It was bait. And Tyler had swallowed it whole. Grandma whispered grace under her breath, as if prayer could stitch the fractures in that room. Mom finally found her voice. "Elena, is any of this true?" I looked at her, at the worry etched across her face, the years of distance carved into her lines. The answer hovered on my tongue, but the training won again. "Some truths," I said gently, "aren't meant to be handled at this table." The words only fueled Tyler's fire. He shot to his feet, chair legs scraping. "That's it? You admit it? She's hiding everything and you're all too blind to see. But not me. I'm not afraid to call her out." He reached for his belt. Not the gun, thank God, but the handcuffs clipped there, metal glinting under the chandelier. And in that moment, I understood this wasn't just an ambush. It was an arrest. The sound of the handcuffs snapping free of Tyler's belt was sharper than it should have been, metal on leather, echoing like a pistol shot in the dining room. Half the table flinched. Aunt June gasped, dropping her fork into the potatoes. Mom's hand went to her mouth. Grandma's eyes stayed fixed on her plate, as though she'd seen this play out before in another lifetime and already knew how it ended. Tyler's voice cracked, but his hand was steady. "Elena Morgan, you are under arrest for impersonating a federal officer." For a moment, no one breathed. I didn't move, didn't speak, just let the silence thrum. His words hung absurdly in the air, caught between Thanksgiving rolls and gravy boats. Yet he believed them with every fiber of his body. He thought he was saving the family, saving the country, saving face. "Tyler," Mom whispered. "Put those away. This isn't—" "Stay out of it, Mom," he snapped. His eyes stayed on me. "Stand up." I remained seated, calm, shoulders relaxed. My training screamed at me not to escalate, not to let adrenaline take the wheel. But beneath the calm, my pulse ticked steady as a metronome. "You really want to do this?" I asked, voice quiet. "Yes," he said louder. "Stand up." I rose slowly, every muscle controlled, deliberate. My chair creaked back. The room seemed to shrink, walls closing in the chandelier light, bleaching everything pale. Tyler stepped closer, cuffs gleaming in his hand. "Hands behind your back." I turned slow as clockwork and did exactly as he asked. Gasps rippled around the table. Someone muttered, "Oh God." The metal clinked shut around my wrists, cold against my skin, not unfamiliar. I'd worn worse restraints in worse places. My body knew how to adapt. Tyler's grin spread like wildfire across his face. He thought he'd won. He thought this was the proof, the validation he'd been starving for. I didn't fight him. Fighting would give him exactly what he wanted: resistance, guilt, drama. Instead, I dipped my head slightly, as though bowing to some invisible audience. In reality, the movement gave me the cover I needed to press my thumb against the discreet device sewn into the belt under my jacket. A haptic click, subtle, gone in a second. Signal sent. He tugged the cuffs once, testing their hold. "Fraud," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the table to hear. I straightened wrists, pinned, eyes level. "You've made a mistake." "No," he snapped. "You did." The folder of papers sat between us, pages wrinkled, greasy with fingerprints. Evidence to him. Noise to me. But in the right hands, those scraps were a federal offense. And soon the right hands would arrive. "Sit down," he ordered, pushing me toward a chair. I obeyed. Not because of him, but because patience was my weapon. The family sat frozen, caught between disbelief and dread. Aunt June whispered something about calling the police before remembering Tyler was the police. My younger cousin stared at me like I'd grown horns. Mom's eyes glistened, but she stayed silent. The air grew thick, cloying with the smell of turkey grease and fear. Every tick of the wall clock dug deeper. "You all see it now," Tyler said, pacing behind me, his voice rising. "She's not one of us. She's been playing us, lying to us. I did what had to be done. I'm the only one willing to stand up. No one applauded. No one nodded. But no one spoke against him either. That silence was the cruelest cut. I studied their faces one by one. People I'd bled for in ways they'd never know, people whose freedom had been paid with sacrifices I couldn't share. And here they sat, letting him chain me at a dinner table, turkey growing cold between us. It wasn't betrayal, not exactly. It was ignorance. And ignorance was a heavier chain than any cuff. Through the window, headlights passed slow along the street. Not the usual meandering of holiday traffic. This was measured, deliberate. My pulse slowed. 12 minutes since I'd pressed the signal. 12 minutes was right on time. I shifted slightly, metal biting into my wrists, the steel digging just enough to remind me of old scars. Tyler leaned close, his breath sour with wine. "You're finished," he whispered. I smiled faintly, just enough for him to see. "You think so?" His jaw clenched. He turned back to the table, raising his voice again. "She's going to prison. Mark my words." The front door rattled, then quiet at first, then firm. 3 precise knocks. Tyler's head whipped toward the sound. Grandma's spoon clinked against her bowl again. She closed her eyes, lips moving in silent prayer. I stayed still, waiting, letting the moment stretch. Because in war, timing is everything. The 3 knocks weren't casual. They carried weight, measured, deliberate, practiced. Anyone who's ever stood watch at a secure facility knows the rhythm. Authority doesn't announce itself loudly. It simply arrives. The dining room froze. Tyler's chest puffed, his hand brushing the butt of his holstered sidearm. He thought this was backup. He thought someone had come to join his theater. I knew better. Grandma's eyes fluttered open. "It's them," she whispered, voice nearly lost under the clink of dishes. The door opened without waiting for permission. Smooth, efficient. 2 men stepped inside, no uniforms, no flashing lights, just plain clothes, pressed neat jackets that didn't wrinkle even when they moved. Their eyes swept the room like scanners. They weren't here to eat. Deputy Brooks, the taller one, said, his voice calm but cutting. "Disarm yourself." Tyler stiffened. "Excuse me." "Your weapon. Place it on the table." Laughter sputtered out of him, forced. "You don't get to walk into my grandmother's house and—" The second agent's hand moved, not to a weapon but to his badge. Not local, not state, federal. The kind that shuts doors without knocking twice. Tyler's bravado cracked. He tried again, weaker. "I'm in the middle of a lawful detainment." "Correction," the taller one said, stepping forward. "You're in the middle of obstructing a federal operation." The cuffs around my wrists clicked once, then released with a subtle magnetic override. My hands came free. I rubbed the faint line on my skin and folded them neatly in my lap. Tyler's eyes widened. "Wait, what the hell is this?" "You've mishandled classified documents, Deputy," the shorter agent said. His tone was even, almost bored, like this was routine. "Those papers you waved around, they don't belong to you. And they sure as hell don't belong at a Thanksgiving table." Murmurs rippled through the family, disbelief tangled with fear. Aunt June covered her mouth again. Mom looked at me, searching for explanation, but I offered none. Tyler's hands twitched near his gun. The taller agent's voice sharpened. "Last chance. Disarm." His face went scarlet. For a second I thought he might draw. But then, with a shaking hand, he unlatched his holster and set the weapon on the table. The heavy thud of steel against wood silenced even the clock on the wall. The shorter agent collected it, slipping it into a case with practiced ease. Smart choice. And then he entered. Not in a rush, not with force, but with a gravity that shifted the air in the room. 3 stars pinned crisp on his shoulder. His uniform pressed, sharp shoes gleaming like mirrors. He didn't need to speak to command the room, the air bent around him. He walked in slow, measured steps, his eyes scanning each face before settling on me. And then, to the shock of every person in that room, he stopped, clicked his heels, and offered a salute. "General Morgan," he said, his voice deep, resonant. Are you unharmed? The world went silent. Tyler blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish dragged onto dry land. Jen, what? Grandma crossed herself, whispering something inaudible. My mother's hand trembled against her glass. The cousins stared as if the ceiling had collapsed. I rose slowly, my cuffs gone, and returned the salute. All secure, sir. The general's eyes flicked to Tyler, then to the folder still bleeding papers across the table. His jaw hardened. This is the man. Yes, sir, I said. Tyler stumbled back, shaking his head. No, this isn't real. She's lying. You're all lying. She's not a general. She can't be. Deputy Brooks, General Hale interrupted, his voice a thunderclap. You've interfered with an active federal officer. You've tampered with classified material. You've attempted unlawful detainment of a superior in the United States Armed Forces. That's treason-adjacent behavior at best. Do you comprehend the severity? Tyler's lips quivered. She's my cousin. The general's eyes narrowed. She's your commanding officer. The words detonated like ordnance in the room. No one moved. No one breathed. The agents began collecting every page, every photocopy, every scrap Tyler had paraded. They wore gloves, sealed evidence bags, documented chain of custody with clinical precision. The sound of Velcro tearing and plastic zipping filled the silence where conversation had once been. Tyler tried to lunge forward, but the taller agent blocked him effortlessly. Step back, deputy. This is insane, Tyler shouted, voice cracking. She's lying. She's not who you say she is. General Hale didn't even look at him. He turned to me instead. Orders, General. I felt every eye on me burning, begging, doubting. My family waiting for me to speak. Tyler waiting for me to crack. But I kept my voice level. Proceed by the book. Hale nodded once. Understood. The agent stepped in, and before Tyler could blink, his wrists were cuffed with the same steel he'd used on me. The irony didn't escape anyone. As they pulled him back from the table, Tyler twisted, shouting, You think this means anything? You think you've won? They'll see the truth. They'll see. But the rest was lost as the door shut behind him, his voice echoing into the cold night. The dining room sat hollow, heavy. Plates, half-eaten glasses, untouched, a turkey cooling under the weight of revelation. General Hale smoothed his jacket, turned back to me, and nodded. Apologies for the interruption, General. We'll handle the fallout. Then softer, just for me, you did well. I inclined my head. Silence usually does the work. And with that, he left, his presence trailing like the wake of a ship impossible to ignore, even after he was gone. The room remained frozen, every family member grappling with a truth too vast to hold. They'd thought I was an imposter, a fraud. Now they realized they'd been sitting across from a general of the United States Air Force. And silence was all I gave them. The door shut behind Tyler with a finality that rattled the glass panes. His muffled protests faded down the walkway, swallowed by the cold November night. The agents moved like shadows, sealing evidence bags, their boots whispering against the hardwood. When they left nothing behind but silence. I stood there in the center of it, cuffs gone, hands free, pulse steady. My family stared at me like they were seeing me for the first time. No one spoke. The turkey cooled untouched. The cranberry sauce congealed in its bowl. The house smelled of cinnamon and fear. Finally, Mom whispered, Elena, is it true? Her voice trembled like porcelain about to crack. I looked at her, at all of them. The aunts, the cousins, the grandmother who had once braided my hair and whispered bedtime prayers. People I had defended without their knowledge, for whom I had crossed oceans and deserts. Yes, I said softly, it's true. They waited for more, for details, for stories, for the unspooling of secrets I had no right to share, but silence was the only gift I could give. Because silence protected the living and honored the dead. The weeks that followed unfolded like the aftermath of a storm. Tyler was suspended first, then stripped of his badge. The charges were quiet at first: misuse of authority, mishandling classified documents. But by the time the federal case built, his name was painted across court dockets and local headlines. Deputy accused of tampering with federal evidence. The private investigator Howard Denton took his own fall. Illegal entry, destruction of property, attempted theft of classified material. His license revoked, his reputation gutted. I didn't have to testify in open court. My statement was sealed, a few careful words inked into the record. The rest was handled by men and women whose names would never make the news. Tyler called me once from county lockup. His voice shook, anger and desperation tangled into something pitiful. "You ruined me," he spat. I didn't answer. Silence did the work for me. At home, the fractures spread. Aunts whispered that I had betrayed Tyler. Others whispered he had betrayed me. Mom tried to bridge the distance, but even she carried questions in her eyes she didn't dare ask. Only Grandma remained steady. She sent me a letter, neat cursive, etched with a trembling hand. "I always knew who you were. Silence is not weakness, it is strength. I am proud of you." I kept that letter tucked in my flight jacket, close to the heart where medals had never mattered. Months later, I stood on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base, boots pressed to the concrete as the engines of a fighter jet screamed to life. The air vibrated through my chest, sharp and alive. I watched the jet climb into the sky, silver against the blue, and thought of Tyler, his cuffs clicking shut, his face twisted in disbelief, the silence that buried him deeper than any words I could have spoken. Revenge wasn't fire. It wasn't fury. It wasn't even confrontation. Revenge was letting truth stand unshaken while lies collapsed under their own weight. It was knowing that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a gavel or even a title. It's silence. Thanksgiving would never be the same. That table would always carry the ghost of what happened, the empty chair, the memory of steel cuffs gleaming under a chandelier. But I didn't return to clear my name. I didn't return for closure. I returned because sometimes the battlefield finds you even at a dinner table, even surrounded by family. And when it does, you don't fight for validation. You fight for control. Tyler thought he exposed a fraud. What he really exposed was himself. So if you've carried silence, if you've shouldered it like armor, if you've been accused, doubted, or dismissed, know this: silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. Sometimes the strongest revenge is to let your truth outlast their noise. If this story struck you, share it. If it reminded you of strength you've carried quietly, subscribe and stay. There are more stories where silence speaks louder than words. Because silence isn't empty. It's power.